Welcome to the Holistic Health Show, where the worlds of science and spirituality converge to illuminate a path towards total well-being. Join us as we embark on a journey to bridge the gap between Western medicine and complementary therapies. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Holistic Health Show. Today we have Carole Preston joining us from Canada. Carole is an art psychotherapist. And Carole, I don't know a whole lot about art psychotherapy, so I'm hoping that you can just dive right in and share with us what it is and why you do it.
Sure. Art psychotherapy is art therapy. Maybe some folks are more familiar with art therapy as a profession or as a mode for therapy. But basically what it is, it's like talk therapy, but all of the expression and all of the kind of therapeutic process happens through art and through creation and creativity. So in order to experience art therapy, it's not just sitting down with a coloring book. You need to have an art therapist. There's a therapeutic relationship with an art therapist who is trained in art therapy or art psychotherapy. And then you also need to have creativity or materials and art process alongside of that. Art therapy in Canada is not as well known, I found, as talk therapy or just going to a psychologist or social worker or even like an occupational therapist. They can do therapy now too, but it's not as well known. But in other parts of the world, it is. Like, I think it's quite common in Australia, New Zealand, the United States, in the UK as well. I just graduated from my art therapy program last year. And so I've been building a practice since then. It was a 2-year program. And before that, there was always elements of art and creativity in my life and in other positions that I had throughout my life, through my 20s and 30s. And it all just kind of coalesced into like, oh, this actually makes sense for me. It really weaved in together all these random strands of working with youth when I was younger and having done arts-based workshops and arts-based community development type projects. And then, I feel like when people get into being a therapist sometimes, or even into the wellness and mental health field, it's because they have kind of personal things that happen to them. For myself, a number of years ago, my brother passed away, which was terrible. But one of the ways that I managed that grief and dealt with the grief was to engage in art. And so I didn't do it necessarily with a therapist, although I have, I've experienced art therapy for myself as a client. But at that point, just need something that kind of takes me out of this kind of pain from this loss. And I started doing just online tutorial videos that were like an hour long and fit exactly within the time frame of my son's napping because he was a baby at that point. And I was kind of able to get into a flow state with that and was able to just find that calmness and centering that I needed and just like a place to put that kind of sadness and energy into that. And as I kind of went through that journey, I kind of got to a point where I was living in a rural area and looking at like, what can I offer in the community and where can I go next for a career? In rural areas, there's not as many opportunities unless you have some sort of a professional designation, then you can really kind of make it work, a trade or professional kind of designation. And I didn't really have that. I had an undergrad in psychology. And so I was like, hey, if I'm going to go back to school, I want it to be something that I'm passionate about, something that I can connect to and have it be something different that I can offer to folks in my community and also in a virtual capacity. Yeah, it was a beautiful journey to becoming an art therapist. But I got to meet people from all over the world and got to learn about art therapy and all of the goodness that it can bring to people. And I really got to experience like the use of materials as well.
If we could go back and just explain to me and the listeners, what is psychotherapy on its own, first of all?
Yeah, being a psychotherapist and being a psychologist are two different things. The training that you do is a little bit different, and also your ability to do assessments. Where I am in Alberta, psychotherapy is not really a common thing. You're either a psychologist or you're a social worker, or as mentioned, the occupational therapy. And I'm licensed as a psychotherapist, a qualifying psychotherapist out of Ontario. But I am an art therapist or an art psychotherapist, so I only practice art. So I don't do any testing. And like if someone was needing an official diagnosis from the DSM, I'm not the person that someone would come to. Like you would have to go to a psychologist for that.
All right. And then everyone hears a lot about talk therapy because that's kind of what's been the norm for a very long time. And you're hearing more and more, different modalities coming up that are venturing away from exclusively talk therapy. And I'm curious, how is one processing, releasing, managing their emotions or their trauma through art therapy? So you mentioned it's not just sitting down with a coloring book. When I think art, I think back to, grade 9. I'm doing paper mache. I'm told to draw something specific. You're doing portraits. I'm thinking of all the construction and building type art forms, but I guess I'm not putting the two together as to how doing that, aside from it being a relaxing project, I'm not putting it together on how that's helping somebody deal with trauma or cope with, like you said, the death of a family member, so grief. So could you explain a little bit how that process works?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a neuroscientist, and so I'm sure there's other folks that can talk about kind of the connections and that kind of thing in the brain more so than I can. But the understanding that I have and what I was taught was that different materials do different things for us. And I think there's a lot of research now on like somatic therapies and the use of the body to get rid of stress and anxiety and all of that. And so with art therapy, like you're moving your body. There's like art therapy and then there's expressive arts therapies, which integrates more dance and music and voice. And you can have like elements of that kind of expression within art therapy. But for me, I primarily work with art materials. And then I like to combine kind of poetry in it. With talk therapy, you're only accessing one portion of your brain at the part that talks. But when folks experience traumatic events, it's not coded in language. It's coded in sensations, smell, body positions, taste, color, kind of texture, how the air feels around you. It's not
Very physical, isn't it?
It's a very physical thing, right? Because when something traumatic happens, it overwhelms our nervous systems, right?
It's interesting. As you're saying that, I'm just thinking when you think about a trauma or some, big event, you can't always describe it in words. You can't always express vocally how it makes you feel.
Hmm.
But yet you can say how physically it makes you feel.
Yeah.
You've gotten an overwhelming sense of nausea, or you're getting neck pain, headaches, you're associating, like you said, some of the senses with this event.
That cognitive portion of your brain that is like the center for language and that kind of gets shut down when something really traumatic happens and you go into fight or flight, right? And then everything is a response that way. And then also with trauma, those events keep happening over and over again and are kind of alive in your body, and you're not really present in the here and now. And so when you're using art, there's so many different levels it can work on. So it can bring you into the here and now because you're engaging in the here and now with the material. So you're working with like, I'm holding Play-Doh in my hand, right? And maybe this Play-Doh was in the refrigerator or in the freezer, so it's cold, and then it's giving you that sensation, kind of bringing you here. And then as if you're working with someone who has had a really big trauma in their life, however they defined it, and they're having a hard time being in the here and now, you can take them from that. We're just working with touch first, and we're working with senses first. And then you can kind of move up from senses into other areas where eventually at the very top, at the very end of kind of your process, you're ending with maybe they're working with poetry, or maybe they're talking, maybe they're actually writing things down about that process, where maybe in the beginning, all they can do is play with plasticine or clay or get their hands into whatever it is that you're offering them to kind of work with, right? Where they can kind of feel that out, be in the here and now, and then also be able to release some of that stress and tension. There's some really good books that while I was in my art therapy program that I read that were like wonderful additions to the things that I was learning. So one of them is an older book, and I think a lot of people know about it. It's Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score. It's really interesting in that book because he doesn't talk so much about art therapy, but he talks about creativity. And he talks about how, or if you've experienced so much trauma and you are unable to be creative, or you don't have that capacity for creativity because you're in fight, flight, flee, mode that you can't find an alternative solution. You can't find a solution to get yourself out of it. He did a lot of research on adverse childhood experiences, where if you have so many of these adverse childhood experiences, you're more likely to experience mental health issues, or you're more likely to have an official diagnosis of something within the DSM. So you could be labeled as bipolar, have schizophrenia, like all of these things, depression, all of this. And it's kind of through his longitudinal study of hundreds of thousands of people in the United States, what he found was if they had more of these adverse childhood experiences, they were more likely to have this. And so within his book, he kind of unpacks his research over his lifetime. And then he talks about creativity and how, if you're not creative, if you don't have that like spark for creativity, because that's been kind of shut out of you, you're not going to be able to find creative solutions to your problem. He works with imagery as well. So like he kind of talks a little bit about his process, which is always getting clients to breathe and ground themselves and be in the here and now and learning how to breathe again. And then creating he does this draw me a picture of your childhood kind of thing. And he uses that to assess kind of where the client's at. So then for myself, I think a lot of people, they've only done arts and crafts when they were little. I get clients who haven't played with plasticine or clay or Play-Doh since kindergarten, but as soon as they touch it, it's like they sink into it and it just taps into different areas. And I think like if part of being an art psychotherapist is to encourage creativity and to spark creativity within people, because so many people are like, I'm not an artist, I can't do art therapy. It's not about being an artist. It's not even about the final product at all. It's about the process. It's about the materials. And it's also about the therapeutic relationship. One of the biggest factors in success and healing when you go to any kind of therapy, talk therapy, art therapy, is the relationship that you have, is that therapeutic relationship with the therapist. And so vitally important is to find a therapist that you can work with and that you like, and that when you sit across from them, you feel that they're trustworthy and you kind of gel with them. And, it's a therapeutic relationship, so you're not going to be friends, but you still have to feel comfortable that they've got you, that they're going to hold you and introduce you to things, especially for art therapy, for myself, that I'm going to introduce you to things that are going to help to keep you safe, but are also going to expand you a little bit. So what happens as well sometimes when we were talking about the materials and kind of how they can be useful and how they're different from talk therapy is sometimes we get to a space where if you are always used to being in control, and then as you're going through therapy, you're kind of getting closer to maybe experimenting with materials that don't provide that kind of control.
And what are some of the other materials? So you mentioned like Play-Doh or plasticine. And I'd like to know, I guess, what would you start someone with?
Yeah, I mean, it's not, maybe it's not even going to be a surprise because it's just kind of standard art materials. So like at the lower end of the spectrum for rigidity, it's clay and plasticine. And you might even do woodworking or whittling or that kind of thing within your studio. The middle of the road stuff is like oil pastels, some like thicker acrylic paints. Collage is a big one. A lot of people love collage. To work with collage, it's also you're just selecting images and placing them on the page. So it's very low risk. And then the fluid media is watercolors. Like if you know how to use watercolors, you kind of have trained yourself how to use watercolors. It's great. But you have to have, like if you're just coming into watercolors, they kind of go everywhere. It's hard to make something really awesome, but you can use that like watercolor or India ink as well. Get that on the page and kind of move it around. Like when I have clients, I usually work with multiple materials within a session. And we might do a couple of different images to unpack whatever it is that they're talking about.
So through the sessions that you're working with people, you're kind of guiding them, are you, to maybe not guiding what they're putting on the page, but guiding the trauma to come out? I don't really know quite the right words to use there.
It's okay. It's always an invitation. Every art therapist is going to work a little bit different, but in general, what happens, you come into the art therapy studio, it might be a big space, might be a smaller space, it might just be sitting around a table. in a private room. And usually there's a little bit of talking in the beginning, like, how are you doing? And maybe what are you interested in working on today or whatever it is. If it's not like an intake session with art therapy is kind of similar to talk therapy. A lot of questions and what they're looking for and setting the stage, but always it's an invitation. So whatever they want to work on, anger management, or I'm frustrated with my mom, or I really want to talk about this thing that happened last week. It could be like really topical as well. Oh, you're stressed at work. So what can we do to release that stress? Depending on who it is that I'm working with, the invitation might be a little bit different every time. And I might go in with a plan based on last session and be like, okay, well, last session they did this, and this is kind of what they created and what they got out of the piece. But now, how can we get them to move along in the process and for their own healing and own self-exploration? But then they might come in and be like, nope, I want to talk about this, and this that happened. You just switch gears, and maybe I've set out Play-Doh, or maybe I've set out plasticine, but I always kind of keep materials close on hand, and they can always say no. It's always about consent as well, always, because some things can be really triggering. Like for myself, I really like working in charcoals, but I don't like how it feels on my fingers. I don't like that dry feeling. I have dry hands anyway. And I also don't like when plasticine dries out on my hands. So you can get into sensory issues too, especially with folks maybe that have autism as well. You have to really kind of pay attention to how people are reacting to materials as well. And also keep in mind that some folks are really people pleasers. And then as they're working with material, it's kind of like, no, you're not into this at all. We're going to switch gears here.
And then you mentioned with the sensory. So I'm curious, you're working with plasticine and Play-Doh. You're molding that with your hands. And then when you're moving into the paints, you would tend to have a paintbrush.
Oh, there's definitely a sensory play element to art therapy as well. Like you're playing with materials, you're exploring materials, you're getting your hands in there. There's like therapeutic value for that as well, that you can really feel how slick it is. And sometimes that's the session. You just lay out a bunch of paint on like a clean kind of surface, and you're just like moving the paint around and really feeling that. And whatever's happening like in your body for that kind of soothing or whatever it is, there's therapeutic value to that.
Just imagining that feels great to me.
I mean, having a good imagination is so important, and having that sense of play that you can play in that. And I think a lot of times especially nowadays, we need permission to play and do those kind of things. Yeah, you can do that within therapy and there's a therapeutic value for it. But Amy, if you want to throw some paint on a table and on a paper and just to get into it one afternoon with paint, that's awesome as well. We should be able to play in that way, right? There's old school art therapy where therapists would interpret the work for the client. And that's not so much what we do anymore at all. We ask questions about the art and we get curious about the art, but we always ask questions and we just observe. And hopefully with the questions that I ask, it helps you to kind of unpack that a little bit for yourself. And then also you get to practice things. You get to practice being in control of a situation. You get to learn how that feels. If it was within a therapeutic space, you get to feel how it feels to be in control of a situation. And then because you know how that feels, if you're used to outside of a therapy situation being out of control or being in situations where you don't have much power, maybe you're going to school and you always have to do what the teachers are telling you or whatever. So you can transfer those skills. Also, another reason I really like art therapy is you can transfer the skills that you're learning within it and that practice element outside and to other things. I wanted to mention there's another book that I really love. Emily and Amelia, I want to say Goss. I might be getting the name wrong, but they wrote a book called Burnout. And all of the research within burnout is done on women, and a lot of psych research is not done on women. It's done on college age men. And it's about the stress cycle and completing the stress cycle. And so what I like about that is that I can kind of marry that information and the information from all of these other resources that aren't directly art therapy or art psychotherapy.
So for those of you listening, if you want to check them out, I will link those below. Carole, I wanted to ask, what types of age groups are you working with or could you work with? And then what sort of people would benefit from art therapy?
Oh yeah, I just want to say everyone. Yeah, I mean, that's very broad. So in my practicum, from age 6 to 75 is who I was working with. You can use art therapy for pretty much anyone. Art therapists will have certain demographics that they will work with, or kind of specialties and niches that they'll work with too. Anyone who is wanting support for their mental health, and anyone who is willing to try out different materials, or at least be in that space. And maybe you don't want to work with certain materials, but you have to get at least a few materials you have to be willing to try and explore. If you're just wanting to come in and talk, like, it is art therapy, so you're getting invited to do things with your hands and to explore materials and to create what's on your mind.
I imagine that would be quite a challenge for some people because often when you're thinking about, again, when you go back to art, and really the
Mhm.
only time many of us have had any interaction with art is through class, where you're
Mhm.
being judged and marked
Yeah.
on it
Yeah.
by maybe your peers who will look over your
Yeah.
shoulder and make a little comment, and
Yeah.
they're not meaning to be rude, but you're 14, 15, 16 years old. They're making comments. Your teachers has decided there was very specific criteria onto what it was you were allowed to do and how you were
Mhm.
allowed to do it. So it wasn't necessarily creative.
Yeah.
It was more draw this
Yeah.
and make it look like it.
Yeah.
So I didn't necessarily find a lot of creativity within that. And
Hmm.
my point here is anyone who's thinking of exploring a different type of therapy outside of talk therapy. I suppose when you go into it, I would feel a bit like, okay, yes, we can talk about what it is I'm going to draw, but I also want to do a good job. And so there's
Yeah.
that challenge as well, that kind of hurdle to test and
Hmm.
just let it flow. Do you find that with some of your clients who come through the door?
Yeah, I think I think it's a common thing. Like, we're all taught to color in the lines, right? When
Yeah.
you learn to color, you're in kindergarten and the teacher's like, "Oh, color in the lines, color in the lines." Like, why do we have to color in the line? Like, there's a stifling of creativity. Like, you can only create in a certain way, and it has to be aesthetically pleasing all the time. And I think that's also like an opportunity in the therapeutic space as well, is to kind of unpack some of that programming that
Mm.
society's put on us, that it has to look nice. I think the other portion as well is you don't have to talk in art therapy. I mean, everyone is different. And I also love a talk therapist, like, I am chatty. I'm a chatty Cathy, and I can chat people's ears off and talk about all this stuff. But sometimes we don't want to talk about it. And sometimes we don't want to verbalize it or anything. And so I think art therapy is an opportunity for us to have healing without having to name it. And also, if there's things that you want to hold back, you can put things in the imagery or in the objects that you've created or whatever it is, or in the way that you're rolling the Play-Doh in your hands that maybe gets asked about, but you can say that you don't want to talk about that, and that you don't have to, because whatever you're working out on the table with the paint everywhere, like, whatever you're working out, it just stays in there and it kind of gets externalized as well into those pieces. It is a challenge though, and it is a barrier for sure, where people are like, well, I'm not artistic and it's not going to be good and whatever. And so why would I do that? And it's kind of like, that is the first hurdle. You don't have to be an artist or call yourself an artist, be an artist, or have gone to art school to get benefits from art therapy. I think it's also anything, you have to choose kind of therapy that you're comfortable with. If you're not such a chatty Cathy, maybe sitting for an hour in a room with a therapist is like, you're just sitting there looking at them like,
Yeah.
or maybe
Trying to
getting
find the
into,
words.
yeah, exactly. Or maybe movement's your thing. There's dance therapists and drama therapists and music therapists,
It's a
right?
lot to explore.
There's so much to explore. It's kind of exciting. We're people and we are diverse. There's common threads, but how we deal with it and how we interact with it and how we process it and the things that we do to process it are all different. Like, way back in the day when we were hunters, gatherers, living in caves or whatever, like, there was always art, always creativity, always music, always those opportunities to create community and healing
Yeah.
community,
Expressive.
be expressive. You can do workshops, you
Mhm.
can do group work. You can also do couples therapy with art therapy, which is always so interesting to me, how people
Yeah.
interact with the invitation that has been presented to them. And what does that say about the couple and how can they practice being together in a new way? But
Yeah.
also using art on a community level for community healing when big stuff happens, or even just community connection in a different way, right? One of the things that I do in my art studio is I have an art hive every Wednesday. And it's not as well attended as I would like, but the concept of the art hive is that you come into a space, there's ample art material, everyone is like an artist in that space, and then you're creating whatever it is that you want to create in that space with other people and around other people. And then you get to have these casual conversations and make art together. And maybe you stay for an hour, or maybe you stay for 2 hours, but you have an opportunity to connect with people in a different way. And in a different space. So I recently connected with a local artist in the community, and she has been developing, it's kind of like her own kind of journey, and she's calling it the main character journey. And so I'm partnering with her to create workshops for her main character journey. It's like really interesting. She's taking ideas from, like comic books, and also from like D&D about creating yourself as like your main character in your life. And she's done a lot with self-portraiture as well to develop that kind of sense of main character. So there's a main quest, which is the main character journey. And then she has other little side quests and stuff that will invite people to do kind of on their own time outside of the main kind of character journey workshop that we're going to be doing. And we're going to do it online so folks can join from wherever it is they are in the world. And like, I would encourage folks, if they're interested in art therapy, check out an art therapy school in the area or online and try a few sessions that way. And then if it's something that you really like, I mean, if you like the student art therapist, great. But if you're like, oh yeah, no, this is good, and now I want to go for someone who's fully certified or fully licensed, then you can do that.
It's always nice to get out and venture into meeting people face to face. But if you're not ready to do that,
Yeah.
or, for whatever reason you can't, it's just excellent to have the resources available online. So
Yeah.
what I'll do, Carole, I'll also share a link to your website and some of your social media pages so that all your listeners out there can check her out, see, do a little deeper dive into what it is Carole does, and reach out if you have questions. Carole, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate your time. And thank you so much for listening to the episode today. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, or if you know somebody who would like or benefit from this episode, please do share it with them. Bye for now. Thanks for joining me on the Holistic Health Show. If you enjoyed the episode, subscribe now and get ready to embark on an incredible journey toward holistic wellness. Until next time, be well and stay holistic.